Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, how important do you think independent academic research is to rulemaking?
It's very important.
Why is that?
When we try to figure out where consumers have problems that warrant regulatory responses and figure out what the proper responses to them are, having the views of researchers of all types is incredibly important as we try to figure out the best possible decisions to make for consumers.
And when you do that, you want it to be as objective and untainted by industry influence as possible. Would that be a fair statement?
When we look at research, our researchers, almost every piece of research we looked at is paid for by somebody. Industry pays for some, consumer groups pay for some, academic institutions pay for some. What we try to do is we look at all of the research regardless of who funded it. We look at the underlying data to try to see how strong it is, how relevant it is to the issues that we have to decide. So we don't go into looking at research from the perspective of we shouldn't consider those that are research funded by industry, or we shouldn't consider it if it's funded by consumer advocates. We consider all of it.
Okay. But surely you rank them in terms of objectivity and consider the source. For example, the Washington Post and the Atlanta Journal talked about a story where the payday lending industry directly tried to influence the rule-making process through the use of an academic research paper. Consumer Credit Research Foundation, a payday lending industry group led by Hillary Miller, paid a Kennesaw State University professor named Jennifer Priestley $30,000 to ghostwrite a, quote, academic, unquote, study clearly designed to influence policy. Emails show that Mr. Miller provided line edits and drafted the paper's abstract. That is to say, the industry lobbyist and advocate, not the academic professor. He instructed the professor, however, not to use the term cycle of debt. In another, she responded, and I quote, "I'm here to serve you with special interest. I just want to make sure that what I'm doing analytically is reflecting your thinking," she said. Professor Priestley offered Mr. Miller authorship credit, but he wisely declined, stating in an email, and I quote, "We want them to believe that the results are honest," unquote. Now, is that the kind of research you'd look at just like any other academic research prior to rulemaking?
I think what we would do is we would take a look at what the data itself was.
Well, let's not talk theoretically. Are you familiar with this case?
With the
case I'm describing that was published and written up in the Washington Post and the Atlanta Journal?
I have read that article at some point in time, yes.
Did it bother you?
It bothered me in the sense that I never liked the idea that people are trying to spin information in a way to achieve a result that information on the merits may not warrant.
Well,
but from the point of view...
does it bother you at all that somebody flat out would make an assertion that's not true? For example, the cover of Professor Priestley's ostensibly independent report falsely stated that the payday industry, and I quote, "did not exercise any control over the study or over the editorial content of the paper." We know from emails that's flat out untrue. So she submitted a paper to you, your organization, that was factually untrue and clearly misleading at best.
If someone submits something to us that is factually untrue, certainly that troubles me. What I think we would do as part of a rulemaking, however, is try to look at the actual data and analysis itself to see whether there were reasons why it may be useful to us or not. It may not be useful to us on the merits, but certainly the idea that someone is making misstatements, misrepresentations about the research they provide us would concern us.
Well, I'm glad it concerns you. Maybe that's your Minnesota nice coming through. But for me, I'm bothered by that answer, because when we know that the industry is paying for it, when we know the industry is directly interfering with content and editing it, when we know that the author of that report is not telling the truth in asserting industry had no influence over this paper, when in fact we know from emails the contrary is true, I'd throw that paper out. I don't care what data they've got. It's so tainted and so corrupt, you risk compromising public confidence in your rulemaking process, even looking at something like that.
I'd like to offer one response to that, just to be very specific and clear. Our reconsideration proposal that was put together on my watch does not in any way rely on that particular research. So whatever its merits or demerits, it is not part of our current proceeding in what we're looking at.
Yeah, I thank you. My time is up, but I'd feel better if you told me when something comes to us that tainted, we put it aside. We don't allow it to corrupt the rest of the process. And I do think, Mr. Paul, you've got to take into account, public confidence in the process. And that's not, it may be intangible, but it's not inconsequential. For all of government to work, we've got to make sure we're doing what we can to reassure the public that the process is an open, objective, fair one. And when we know that industry is paying for a paper posing as an academic research paper directly to influence your rulemaking on their self-interest, that taints and corrupts the process. And I'd feel a lot better if you told me we throw that in the trash bin when we get it. My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.